It's really a singular honor to be able to present to you Professor Peter Singer tonight. One of the most influential philosophers of our time, Dr. Peter Singer is the era W.D. Kemp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University and Laureate Professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne, Australia. He has published numerous influential articles and more than 24 very important books, such as Famine, Affluence and Morality, Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, One World Now, The Life You Can Save, The Most Good You Can Do, The Ethics of What We Eat, Rethinking Life and Death, and The Point of View of the Universe, etc., etc. And for philosophers, he has written books on Marx and Hegel as well. Professor Singer's work in practical ethics has been a major force in transforming the world of philanthropy and the treatment of animals. He has truly shaken the conscience of our contemporary societies in more than one way. His presence on our campus affords us the opportunity to sensitize ourselves to the ethics of living in a globalized world. Professor Singer will speak on living for one world today. And after his talk, there will be a Q&A session which will be moderated by Professor John Liza, the chair of our philosophy department. Q&A will be followed by a book signing ceremony. You can buy your book in the lobby and bring it in for signing. Department of Philosophy is grateful to the President's Strategic Initiative Program, Association of Campus Events, and Office of the Dean College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for their support for this important annual event and this important visit by one of the most distinguished philosophers, Professor Peter Singer. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Peter Singer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adil, and thank you all of those who have been involved with facilitating my visit, making it possible, making it all run very smoothly. So I'm very happy to be here and to have the chance to commemorate World Philosophy Day by speaking to you. My topic, as you just heard, and as you can also see behind me, is living for one world. That's a very large topic. There are many things that I could have put into that, and in fact the book that is available, One World Now, covers this area, but I'm not going to be able to go into all of those issues tonight. Would be, I think, too much to try to cover in the time that I have allocated. So I'm going to focus on these three global ethical issues, starting off by talking about extreme poverty, which is an issue that I've written about for many years. Some brief remarks about global inequality, which is a concern that many people have been talking about recently. And then go into the question of climate change, which, as I say here, is the ultimate global problem in that it's a problem that, if it is to have a solution, has to have a global solution. It's the ultimate example of needing to think on a global level. So, let me go into these questions and begin, as I say, with the question of what ought we to do about extreme poverty. Now, I know that some of you here, I think the philosophy majors in particular, have been encouraged to read a little book that I've published called Famine, Affluence and Morality, the core of which is a previously published article with the same title, which produced an example that has become quite well known and often discussed of a drowning child in a shallow pond. The way the story goes, as I told it originally, is that you're walking across a park, perhaps you're walking across a beautiful campus like this one, and there's a shallow pond on this campus. You know that it's not deep because in summer you see people playing in the water, and teenagers and adults can stand up. But it's not summer now, it's too cold for anyone to be swimming, and so you expect the pond to be empty. But as you walk past it, you notice some splashing going on, and when you look closer, you see, to your shock and surprise, that there is a very small child, just a toddler, who is in the pond, and the pond is too deep for a toddler to stand up, so the toddler is in danger of drowning. So you look around and you think, where are the parents of this child, or the babysitter? Somebody must be looking after such a small child, but you don't see anybody there. Your next thought is, well, this child is in danger of drowning. I better run down, jump into the pond, and rescue the child. But before you do that, you have one further, less noble thought, and that is that because you're going to an important meeting, you've put on your very best clothes, expensive shoes, pants, whatever it might be, and they're going to get ruined if you rush into this muddy pond. So the thought occurs to you, well, this child isn't my responsibility. It's not my child. Nobody asked me to look after this child. Never seen this child before. And I certainly didn't contribute in any way to the child being in the pond. Had nothing to do with it. So why don't I just go on my way? Why don't I just forget that I ever saw the child, go to my meeting, not have to replace my fine clothing? Now, I often ask audiences what they would think of a person who did that, and the answer I get, usually unanimously, sometimes there's one or two contrarians if the audience is big enough, but usually people say, that would be an awful thing to do. How could you even think of comparing a child's life with the value of your clothing? So, we ought not to do that. Nobody ought to do that. It would be wrong to do that. Whatever language you want to use, whatever moral language you want to use, most people would agree that it would be quite wrong to ignore the child in the pond in order to avoid the modest cost to you of replacing the clothing. Well, a few years ago in China, a case not all that dissimilar to this occurred, and that's what this slide is about. This was a scene shot from a video camera that was running in this street in China. In fact, you can see the whole video if you want to go online. The city is called Foshan, but I don't want to show you the video. It's really not at all pleasant viewing. This is a small girl who somehow got away from her mother. Her mother lost track of her, wasn't looking after her carefully enough, got into the street and was hit by a van. And what you see here is the child, Wang Yu is her name, lying in the street after being hit by the van. And here's a passerby walking past the child, but actually averting his gaze. So he's more or less, he couldn't have not seen the child when you look at the whole video, but he's averting his gaze, pretending not to have seen the child, and walking on. And he's not the only one. The video runs for quite a long time. There are 17 people who either walk or cycle past the child lying in the street, and tragically, another van comes along and runs over the child a second time. Eventually, a street cleaner does stop to help the child and raises the alarm. The child is taken to hospital, but it's too late. She dies. So this is a real story of people, again, not helping the stranger in need of help. And when that video was shown on Chinese television, it did cause the same sort of reaction that, as I say, I get from audiences. In other words, people said, how could anybody do this? What kind of a people are we that we would ignore a small child who's obviously injured and in need of help? But people did do that. And again, if we think that that's wrong, if you think in listening to this story, which is a real story, not an imaginary one, well, I would never have been like that person. I would have not only seen the child, but stopped and drawn attention to the child's plight and said, what's going on here? Something terrible is happening. This child needs help. The child at least needs to be cared for by a parent, if not taken to hospital. If you think that, then the same question arises that I raise about the child in the pond. That is, if you agree that it's wrong not to help somebody where you could do something really important, quite likely save somebody's life, and the cost to you is pretty minor. In this case, it doesn't even seem to be anything like replacing your clothes. Maybe there's some inconvenience. Some of the people in the discussion in China said, well, you would then have to tell the police about what had happened. There would be a lot of bureaucracy, so there would be inconvenience. Some people even feared the police might think that you had somehow been the one who ran over the child. So there would be some inconvenience. But still, that's not enough. That's no excuse. That doesn't compare with the loss of the child's life. Now, if you think that, then I invite you to think about our situation with regard to other children, and adults as well, living in extreme poverty, whose life is also in danger. Not because they're about to drown, not because they've been hit by a van and need to be taken to hospital, but for a whole variety of reasons. A common cause of deaths of small children in developing countries, for example, is malaria. Malaria is prone in many parts of the developing world. It's prevalent. And although both adults and children get malaria, it's typically children 5 and under who die from malaria. Now, it's not hard to reduce the death rate. All you have to do is distribute long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets, take them to the villages where malaria is a problem, give the villagers some brief guidance in how to use the bed nets, and the rate of infection of malaria and consequently the rate of child death will drop quite rapidly. And that's been clearly demonstrated in properly controlled trials where you distribute the nets in some villages, randomly selected, and you don't distribute them in others, just to prove that this really does work, and it really does work, and it's not very expensive. So, if we know this and we don't contribute to an organization that's providing those bed nets, or many other things we can do, that's only one example of ways in which we can save the lives of children in developing countries, are we so different from the person who walks past the pond or this person who walks past the injured child? Because we are also making choices where we are not saving lives when we know we could save lives. That's the question about extreme poverty that I want to pose and I want you to think about. Now, there's a lot of things that people may say in response to this. One thing that people sometimes say is, well, I am doing something to help people in extreme poverty because I pay taxes and part of my taxes goes to foreign aid, and that's helping people in extreme poverty. So let's look at that. I've got a chart here behind me. And this chart shows the percentage of gross national income that countries gave for foreign aid in 2013, which was the last figures that I had available. So as you see, the countries at the top, like Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, they're giving close to 1%. And then it starts to come down a little bit with Denmark, United Kingdom. The line that you see that at 0.7% is a target that the United Nations recommended many years ago, and which, as you can see here, only, 5 nations, well, now 5 nations have actually reached. The Netherlands used to be above that level, but in this particular year, they dropped below it. United Kingdom deserves particular mention because they had historically been significantly below it, and then the two major political parties in Britain agreed on a bipartisan pledge that they would progressively raise the amount of foreign aid their country gave until they reached that UN target of 0.7%. And they did that, well, back in 2013. They'd obviously done it, and they've maintained that level since then. But where's the United States? Well, I don't know if you can see, it's pretty close to the bottom. It's below Portugal, just above Italy. In that year, it's actually just a tick below 0.2%. In other words, less than 20 cents, maybe 19 cents for every $100 that we earn as a nation goes in foreign aid. And as you can see, that's, as a percentage of what we earn, way below other countries that we would think are less wealthy than we are. If you ask people which is the wealthier nation, Portugal or the United States, I think pretty much everyone is going to say the United States. In fact, they're probably going to say the United States, even if you ask them which is the wealthier nation, the United Kingdom or the United States. Yet the United Kingdom, as you can see here, is giving 3.5 times as much as a percentage as the United States. This percentage has been fluctuating a little bit in recent years. I'm not, as I say, sure exactly what it is this year, but it's not going to be very far off that. If it's up, it might be 0.21 or 0.22. It's been up and down a bit over the years, but the United States is, for a very long time, been towards the bottom of that table. And if you ask, how much is this in terms of what my taxes are paying for? As I say, if you think that, well, I'm paying through my taxes. In fact, it's a tiny proportion of your taxes. In terms of total government spending, it's less than 1% of government spending. A lot of Americans think that a much bigger proportion of the foreign aid budget goes, of the government budget, of government spending goes on foreign aid. That's a delusion. So a lot of Americans say, oh, we're spending much too much on foreign aid. We shouldn't be doing that. But then you ask them how much you think we should spend, and they say, oh, maybe 5% of government spending should go on foreign aid, which is pretty funny since they've said on the one hand we're spending too much, and they've named a figure that's 5 times as much as we're actually spending. So there's a real problem of pretty abysmal ignorance in the American public about how much of our government spending goes on foreign aid. So that's no reason why we shouldn't be doing things ourselves. Certainly as active citizens, we should be trying to encourage our government to spend more and to make sure it's well spent. But it's not an excuse for us not to do something ourselves. And I've been asked today in speaking to students, well, you know, if we're students, we don't have very much to spend. That may be true. But you probably do spend some money on things that you don't really need. You know, whether you're buying something to drink when there's safe drinking water available, even that's a luxury in terms of what many people in the world have. So there's probably something that you can put aside and at the end of the week or the month or the year donate. And I think it's good to get into that habit anyway while you're a student to start donating. Eventually, hopefully, you will have more to spend and you'll earn more and you'll have more that you can donate. So on that basis, why not start now? Okay, there is a movement that is trying to promote exactly what I'm talking about. A relatively young movement that's, well, young in two senses. One is it's been going for less than 10 years. As you see here behind me, I have the Wikipedia entry for Effective Altruism, which is the name of the movement. If you looked in Wikipedia for that term 10 years ago, you wouldn't have found it. The term really didn't exist. It was coined by a group of people centered around Oxford University who were starting to develop this idea and wanted a name for it. So as I say here, or as Wikipedia says here, effective altruism is both a philosophy in that popular sense of a set of values that you live by, and a social movement, a movement made up of people, mostly the millennial generation, that are applying evidence and reason to determine the most effective ways to improve the world. So on the one hand, there's the altruism part of it, the idea that we ought to live so as to make the world a better place. And on the other hand, there is this idea of making sure that whatever resources we use are doing the most good that they can, not wasting them. And it's interesting that this idea, in terms of donating, giving, altruism, this idea of making sure that you're getting the best value that you can for what you donate is still somewhat novel. Compare that with when you go out to buy something, right? Let's say you need a new laptop or a new phone. So you probably will look around, you'll look online. Where do I get good value for money? What features do I need? How can I get them without paying too much? And if you do go out and buy a laptop and say, hey, I just got this laptop and it does this and this and this, and your friend says, how much did you pay for it? And you said $2,000. And he said, you're nuts, you could have got the same laptop for $1,000. You're going to feel pretty stupid. You didn't do your homework. But strangely, similar things will happen in terms of how much value you get for your donation to a charity. And most people won't even know what value they're getting. And sometimes they could have got twice as much value, 10 times as much value, even hundreds of times as much value. And I'll show you why I think that's so in a moment. Let me just say a little bit more about effective altruism as a movement. This is one of the key figures in the movement, Toby Ord. Toby, at the time, about 2009, I'm thinking about, was a graduate student at the University of Oxford. And he was living on a graduate studentship, which was in British pounds, I think around £14,000 a year. Now, as with most studentships, it wasn't a lot of money, but he felt it was enough. He could meet all of his needs. He could still manage to take a vacation in the summer. He traveled across to the continent, France, and had a good time there. So he thought, you know, I could really live on this kind of sum for the rest of my life, adjusted, of course, for inflation. I don't really need more than that. And then he wondered, what else could I do with the money that I can expect to earn? Suppose that I'm successful in having an academic career, as he was hoping to have by being a graduate student in philosophy at Oxford. Suppose that I go on with that academic career. I can roughly estimate what my salary will be for the rest of my life. Look at pay scales as they go up as you get older and so on. Look at what you would earn to retirement age and add all of that up, and you get an idea of how much you're likely to earn over the rest of your life. Then allocate the inflation-adjusted equivalent of your graduate studentship for each one of those years. Subtract that from the total sum, and you've got a pretty tidy sum left over. And Toby thought, what could I do with that amount of money? And so he started to look for really cheap ways of helping people, benefiting people, because that's what he had in mind. And he came up with this. This is a clinic in North Africa for treating children at risk of getting trachoma. Trachoma is the largest single cause of preventable blindness. So these children living in a pretty, fairly poverty-stricken environment with not very good hygiene and in a dry, dusty area are at risk of getting trachoma, which is caused by a microorganism that gets in their eyes. And without treatment, that microorganism will slowly cause the retina to become blurred. So gradually, very slowly over many years, they will lose vision. Their eyesight will become blurred, and eventually, by the time they're perhaps 40, they'll become blind. And then they may live for another 20 years or so without being able to see. Now, this can be very cheaply prevented by simple treatments that you can give to the children as you see happening here. And Toby's calculation, Toby looked at some studies, worked out that it cost about $25 per case of blindness prevented. So he divided 25 into the amount of money that he would have spare by the calculation that I showed you before. And he was astonished to find that he alone, just on a normal academic salary, not being particularly wealthy, would be able to prevent 80,000 cases of blindness. And he thought, that's amazing. If you prevented one case of blindness, that would be a wonderful thing to do. But to prevent 80,000 cases of blindness, I don't know how many your stadium that I saw here holds, but I'm sure it doesn't hold 80,000. So fill that however many times you need to, and think of all those people who could become blind, and you could save them from blindness. So Toby thought people ought to know about that, because if they knew about that, they'd be more likely to want to donate to prevent people from becoming blind, or doing other things that are also highly cost-effective. So he set up this organization that I mentioned in the previous slide called Giving What We Can, and took a public pledge to live on a modest amount and to give the rest to effective charities. And the organization doesn't ask people to pledge that much, it asks them to pledge 10% of their income, but for their career, for their working career, and to give it to effective charities. And there's now more than 2,000 people who've taken that pledge. So that's one example of how you can get great value for your money donating. Here's another one. I, in fact, already mentioned this. This is one of a very lean, well-run organization that is distributing bed nets called the Against Malaria Foundation that you can support. And then let's look at the contrast, because I said that in some you can get many multiples better value in some causes than another. So I don't know if you've ever been to the Lincoln Center in New York City to attend a concert or opera or something of that sort. It's the premier location for classical music events in New York. And it has a concert hall, the Philharmonic's Hall, which was until quite recently known as the Avery Fisher Concert Hall. And the Lincoln Center decided that they wanted to renovate it. And they got a quote, and it came to $500 million, $500 million to renovate one concert hall. And they got an initial donation from David Geffen, who's a billionaire who's behind the DreamWorks. You've seen the DreamWorks logo when you've gone to the movies. He kicked in $100 million, so it's no longer the Avery Fisher Hall, it's now the David Geffen Hall. But the question that I want to raise is, if you had money to donate, how would the value you get to donating it to renovating the concert hall compare with the value you get from the charities that I've just mentioned? And I think the answer is pretty clear, that if you have that choice, the concert hall doesn't make that big a difference to anyone's life. I mean, it's nice to have a concert hall, it's nice to be able to listen to concerts in the best possible concert hall, but the difference between a concert hall as has existed until now and the renovated one is not that huge. And insofar as it makes a difference to people who are already highly privileged. So if you think about, how many people's eyesight could you save? If it's $25 is the relevant figure, then we're talking about 20 million people whose eyesight could have been saved. Hard to believe that you could get any benefit from renovating a concert hall to compare to that. Even if that figure is now wrong, maybe its price has gone up to some extent, maybe it's $100 it costs, it's still going to be 5 million people. So that's an example of what I mean. I think that you're getting hundreds of times better value with the charities that I mentioned than donating to what's also a charity, and incidentally, therefore, given that people on high incomes and therefore high tax rates will be donating, taxes are paying a very substantial amount of this renovation. Okay, how do we know which are the effective charities to give to? As I said, the effective altruism movement is relatively young, but part of it has been the establishment of research, places that do thorough independent research into charities to find which are the ones that are most effective. And here's one of them. It's called GiveWell. Just go to givewell.org and you'll find very detailed research on a lot of charities and recommendations of really just quite a small number of charities, because GiveWell is very, very rigorous in which they regard as their top charities that they recommend that you give to. But you can, because of that, you can be confident that those charities will be really have been rigorously checked out. There are other charity evaluators that have been going for longer. There's a perhaps still better known website called Charity Navigator, but Charity Navigator just tells you about the finances of the organization, basically, and a little bit about its governance, its administration. So a lot of people say, how much of what I donate will go to administration and further fundraising? And that's what Charity Navigator tells you. And of course, if that figure is really very large, if 80% is going to administration and fundraising, forget about it, go somewhere else. But once you get down to something like 20% or 10% or 30%, the figure is not telling you very much anymore, because it's not necessarily true that the organization that spends only 10% on administration does more good with your dollar than the organization that spends 30% on administration. It might be that the organization spends 30% because it's employing really good staff who will go out into the field and will check that the programs they're funding are doing what they're intended to do. And the other organization cuts back on its staff, gives 90% to programs, but has no idea whether the programs are working or not, so perhaps half of them are not working. So you really need an organization that is checking up on what is happening in the field, not just on the finances. And that's why I recommend you look at GiveWell, or I recommend you look at this organization, and in the interest of full disclosure, I need to tell you that I founded this organization. It spun off a book that I wrote with the same title, The Life You Can Save. And I set up a website, and various people discussed things on the website, and gradually the website evolved into an organization, which I don't run in any hands-on way, though I am still a member of the board of directors. But it's also recommending organizations, a somewhat wider spectrum of organizations than GiveWell is. So if you're interested, have a look at that, and there's a lot of information. And we're trying to build a community of people who are making reducing global poverty one of their aims. Okay, let's move on to the second of the topics that I mentioned, inequality. A lot of people are talking about inequality as a big world problem. And here's something from Oxfam, which is, I think, a good anti-poverty organization. It's another organization that I support. And Oxfam had a campaign recently with an image of a luxury yacht like this, and this startling figure: the 85 richest people own the same wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people. In other words, pretty much half the same wealth as half the world's population is the richest 85 people in the world. Now, there certainly are problems about this, problems in the imbalance in not only wealth but also power. But I think that there are different ethical questions that can be asked. With what I've been talking about up to now, extreme poverty, I think there is no ethical doubt that it's better if there are fewer people in extreme poverty, because, as I said, extreme poverty causes premature death, suffering, people can't prevent going blind, and in fact, some people who are blind just from things like cataracts can't get cataracts removed, can't educate their children, can't really have the kind of life that we think is befitting a human being. So that, I think, is clear. But what about inequality? Well, here's a somewhat more nuanced picture of the changes in global inequality from 1988 to 2008. So a period of 20 years, which corresponds pretty much to the opening up of global trade through the World Trade Organization, particularly the entry of China into the World Trade Organization, but also opening up of other large countries like India. And here's what happened during that 20 years. So the top 1%, just 72 million people, their income rose 60%. They did very well as top 1%. Those at or slightly below the median also did very well. In fact, they did even better than the top 1%, rising 70 to 80%. The bottom third also did pretty well, 40 to 70% increase. But the bottom 5%, in other words, the bottom 20th, still 360 million people, did not experience any increase. Now, what should you think about this? If you focus on inequality, you would have to say the world got worse over those 20 years because inequality increased. If the bottom 5% stayed the same and the top 1% go up 60%, well, the gap between the top 1% and the bottom 5% has clearly increased very substantially. So if you focused on inequality, you would think, not good. But if you focus on what's happened to poor people, to very large numbers of poor people, then you're more likely to focus on particularly the bottom third, that figure of 2.4 billion people, very large group of people, and their incomes, on average, have gone up 40 to 70%. Now, it's true that included in that bottom third is the bottom 20th, and their incomes haven't gone up. But that just shows that the average of the bottom third minus the bottom 5% has actually gone up even more. And because this is a very large number of people, it's surely really good that their incomes have gone up, while acknowledging, of course, it's really bad that the very poorest didn't go up. You might say, we want to give priority to the people who are poorest. The philosopher John Rawls, in his theory of justice, thought we ought to give absolute priority to the people at the bottom. So in his view, this is not actually an improvement because it has not improved the lowest level. But I disagree with that. I think even though I wish that the bottom fifth had gone up at least as much as anyone else, still I think what we are looking at here is an improvement over that 20 years. Because so many people who were also very poor, even if not quite at the bottom 5%, have gone up. Other people who were around the median or a bit below it have also gone up a lot. And sure, you know, the top 1% have gone up. You might think they don't deserve it, but I don't think that's a terrible thing. It would only be a terrible thing if somehow they had kept the people at the bottom down. But it's not clear to me that they've done that in any causal sense. Now, we could, of course, say, well, they could help those people at the bottom, and I totally agree with that. I think they should be helping people at the bottom. But I don't think that the inequality in itself is a sign that things have got worse. And there are other indications, too, that things have got better over this period. So let's look at people in extreme poverty. According to, this is the World Bank's figure for extreme poverty, currently $1.90 per day. They adjust it every now and again. So people living on less than $1.90 per day in 1990 was close to 2 billion people, and more than a third of the world's people were in extreme poverty. The World Bank calculates this figure by trying to look at what you need to provide for your basic needs. So what do you need to have enough food, to have some shelter, those kinds of things, just to provide for the basic needs of you and a dependent family, if you have one. So more than a third of the world's population was in that situation where they could not reliably meet their most basic needs. Now, sometime this year, It's not exactly clear whether this has already happened or we'll find out only next year probably when we get the statistics for 2016. But on the basis of the 2015 figures, the World Bank predicted that for the first time, probably for the first time in the history or existence of our species, fewer than 10% of the world's people would be at this level where they can't reliably meet their basic needs. And that's a huge amount of progress in 26 years, dropping from 37% to 10%, despite increasing population. So that's another sign that even if the world has got less equal, there's also less extreme poverty. And you can see this, I don't know how visible this is to you, it's not too bad. You can see that this is actually happening in all regions. So these colored lines are different regions of the world, and you can see that poverty is falling. It's fallen most sharply, the red line that starts at the 80% line at the top left-hand corner, which is East Asia and the Pacific, developing countries only, fallen from 80% right down to something around 20%, very dramatic, and that's large part of that is China's economic growth. But all regions have fallen. The yellow line, which starts around 1990, goes up a little bit and then starts to decline, though more slowly, is sub-Saharan Africa, developing countries only again. So although often people think that sub-Saharan Africa is not making progress, it is making progress in reducing extreme poverty, as are all of the other regions. So that's further good news. And child deaths, I talked about child deaths from malaria. There are many other causes. Measles has been another cause. Diarrhea caused by lack of sanitation has been another major cause. We are making progress in this area as well. And again, you can see how the number of deaths has dropped dramatically in 55 years, from 1960 to 2015, from 20 million to less than 6 million, even though the world's population has more than doubled over that time. So that's why I'm not so troubled by inequality. Of course, if I could wave a magic wand and do away with it, I would. But it seems that a more open global trading system has actually improved the lives of many of the world's poorest people. And I think aid programs have also had a significant impact on some of these figures too. Okay, so let me move then to the third of my topics, and I'll spend a bit more time on this, climate change. Because I'm spending time on this because, as I said at the beginning, I do think that climate change is the ultimate global issue. So if what we're talking about on World Philosophy Day are issues that require us to think globally, not only to think locally, not only to think even of what will make America great, if I dare say it, but rather what will make the world great, or the world a better place, then I think this is an absolutely critical issue. Now, firstly, because I know there are some people who are doubters about the reality of climate change, or perhaps even think it's a Chinese hoax, I've heard someone say, I think we need to look at the figures. And the figures can be represented in various ways. This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Center information, so a US government center, that is looking at the anomalies in temperature over this period from 1880 to this year. And by anomalies, it means it takes the sort of median of all of these years and then says, well, in which years were the average temperatures below this and in which years were they above it? And when you look at this, I think it's a very clear pattern that emerges, that if you go to, was it around 1940 or the late 1930s, every year below that, between 1880 and that year, so about 60 years, is below the average for this longer period that we're looking at. And then you start to get some fluctuations. You get some years above it, some years below it. But But eventually, again, a consistent pattern emerges that you're getting all of the years from sometime in the 1970s, all of the years go above the average. And moreover, the tendency is continuing to climb, as you can see. Some people, some climate skeptics were saying a few years ago that temperatures had plateaued. They were not rising, and they were saying, so this shows that it's not human emissions that are causing climate change because the human emissions are continuing to increase, but temperature is not. But, you know, we don't have this one-to-one correlation because there's a variety of other factors, including whether there is an El Nino or an El La Nina effect in the Pacific Ocean, which makes a difference to global temperatures. Possibly solar variations in solar radiation make a difference. But you can see in any case that even if there was this plateau in some of the early years of this century, 2015 broke all records, was the hottest year on record, and looks like 2016 is going to break that. So it does seem that climate change is real, that it's happening. Now, it might still be said, well, can we be sure that there's not some other cause apart from human greenhouse gas emissions? And it's true that because we can't run this as a controlled trial, we can't set up lots of planets and randomly select half of them to put greenhouse gases into and half of them not to, we can't be 100% sure that this is human greenhouse gas emissions. We can't be 100% sure. But the consensus of scientists think that it is extremely likely. So this is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which draws together the work of thousands of scientists. It's not doing its own research. It's synthesizing, consolidating the work of thousands of scientists published in peer-reviewed journals, and says that it's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the warming that you saw in the previous slide. Extremely likely they define as 95 to 100% probable. So that's the overwhelming consensus of scientists, and I think you'd have to be a very well-qualified person to say that they're wrong. Now, what's going to happen if they're not wrong? Well, we're going to pass tipping points at which things will happen. Perhaps, in fact, some people think we may have already passed some of these tipping points, at which there'll be very drastic changes. So the melting of the Greenland ice sheet would cause a 7-meter rise in sea levels. This is over the next century or so. And of the West Antarctic ice sheet as well, if you add that in, a total of a 13-meter rise by 2050. Now, if you think of a 13-meter sea level rise, then coastal cities, basically, most coastal cities are going to be inundated. Draw the 13-meter contour around Manhattan, there's not a huge amount of Manhattan left. Draw a 13-meter contour around the coast of Florida, there's maybe a third of the coast, a third of the territory of Florida disappears. But coastal cities all around the world are going to be inundated, and of course that includes nations that do not have the wealth and resources that we do, or the options of evacuating large populations and finding other places for them. Indian monsoon is predicted to weaken with climate change, and there's about 1 billion people who depend on the monsoon in, well, more than 1 billion in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So many of them could get into food shortages. Changes in the Atlantic Ocean circulation. If the Gulf Stream stops flowing towards Europe, there are going to be very dramatic temperature drops in Europe. And a more intense El Nino southern oscillation, which will mean more severe droughts in California, and California is already having a severe drought. Also more severe droughts at the opposite end of the scale in Australia, and loss of Amazon rainforest. And these will produce feedback loops. So if we lose the Amazon rainforest, there's a lot of carbon goes into the atmosphere from that. We lose ice sheets, then instead of ice reflecting the sun back into the atmosphere, the heat of the sun, we have rock or ocean which absorbs more of the heat. So various other consequences: more heat waves, more heat deaths, more severe floods, storms, droughts. I've already mentioned rising sea level. Oceans become more acidic because there's more carbon in the atmosphere. They absorb more carbon dioxide and become more acidic, and we don't really know what that will do to marine life. And if we think that there's a refugee crisis in the world now because of Syria and because of refugees going to Europe out of North Africa and people trying to come across our southern border, that's likely to get many, many times worse if climate change does occur and cause the changes that I've mentioned. Stephen Gardner, who's a philosopher at the University of Washington, has written a book called The Perfect Moral Storm, and he uses this idea to say that climate change is not only a problem in weather in terms of storms, but a moral storm because it's a peculiarly difficult one for us to actually do what we need to do to resolve this problem. Why? Well, firstly, because it's a collective action problem. That means we need to act together. And we're familiar with lots of collective action problems. The tragedy of the commons is perhaps the best known collective action problem. You have a common grazing land. Villagers around have the rights to graze their cattle on the commons. For any individual villager, the more cattle you put on the commons, the better the return to you, the more money you make. But collectively, if all the villagers put lots of cattle on the commons, it will be overgrazed, the grass will disappear, it will become a dust bowl, and nobody will make any money out of it. So, okay, you can organize a group of villagers to think about this and act collectively. Can you organize the world as a whole to think about this and not selfishly say, well, we want to burn our coal because that's the cheapest form of energy we have, and we'll have to pay more for alternative forms of energy? That's exactly like saying, I'll get more if I put more cattle on the commons. We need people to say, for the good of the whole, I'm going to agree to stop burning coal and to cut my greenhouse gases in a variety of other ways. So that's the first reason it's so difficult, because it's a global collective action problem. Secondly, although there's potential for immense harm, the harm isn't right here and now. It's not the kind of harm that you see when terrorists break into some place like a theatre and start machine gunning the people in the theatre. We see the harm there. We respond to it immediately. It triggers all of our emotional responses that we've developed, or our ancestors have developed, over many millennia to that kind of violence and sudden death. But the harm here is caused by invisible odorless gases. It's somewhere in the future, even if we see now, for example, a drought in California, which is causing a lot of damage, we have a terrible wildfire season as we had over the summer, we can't exactly say that greenhouse gas emissions caused that. It's likely that they contributed to making that drought greater and to making the wildfire season worse, but we can't really pin it on it. We don't see that exact causal connection. So the harm is more invisible, and a lot of it is in the future, and we're not very good at giving full weight to things that happen in the future. Thirdly, as I've already recognized, there is some degree of scientific uncertainty. I don't think it's very great, but there is some, and that enables people to be doubters, to cling to this and say, well, why should we make these sacrifices? Why should we pay more for our energy? Or why should we have a carbon tax? The scientists might be wrong, and it might turn out to be quite unnecessary. So we cling to that. And finally, there's also some ethical uncertainty. There's an ongoing discussion and debate. So who should be doing more about this? Is it nations like the United States? A lot of people think that the United States and other affluent nations should be doing more, partly because of their historical responsibility for the problem, because the greenhouse gases now in the atmosphere were largely emitted by the industrialized countries in the years since the Industrial Revolution. So countries that have still not industrialized or have only industrialized relatively recently are responsible for less of the problem. So there's a whole lot of debates about who should do what. And countries with people in poverty may say, well, you burned a lot of fossil fuels in order to produce your level of prosperity, get your people out of poverty. Are you now saying that we can't do the same? That we can't get our people out of poverty by using the cheapest energy to industrialize and help them find jobs? So there's ethical uncertainty as well. So that's why it's so difficult for us to act. Let me just say a little bit about this idea that the science might be wrong, which, as I've already said, I don't think it's very likely. But suppose that you disagree with me about that. Suppose you have some theory that says, no, I think actually that estimate of 95% probability is far too high. But I agree, of course, it could be that human emissions are causing climate change. I don't really know for sure, can't really disprove that. Suppose that you think that there's a 50% chance. I mean, as I say, I think that's far too little on the basis of the evidence. But just for the sake of the argument, suppose that you do think that. You can then still ask, should we take a 50% chance that the scientists are right and the consequences that I've just described will occur, rather than decarbonize the economy with the extra cost that is involved in doing that? Well, I think if you look at that, that would be a very silly gamble to take, because the costs, if the scientists are right, are enormous for our children and our grandchildren and many future generations. And some of those costs will happen quite soon. Some of them will happen with your students, quite likely to be happening in your lifetime, including significant increases in the number of refugees, and if not, certainly in your children's lifetime, if the scientists are right. And if the scientists turn out to be wrong, what have we lost? Well, we've reduced our burning of coal, for example, but coal, in any case, is a pretty polluting fuel that causes respiratory diseases, and the cost of getting away from it will not be so high. We'll eventually develop science for cleaner energy, cheap, cleaner energy. So the costs are not hugely great. They're not insignificant, but they're not hugely great. And they're certainly not anywhere near half as great as the costs that would be incurred if it turns out that the scientists are right. So just looking at it in terms of what economists call expected value, or if you like, the value of taking a ticket in a lottery, you'd be stupid to take a ticket in a lottery where there was a 50% chance of you having to pay a huge penalty, whatever you might put that of. Sorry, I've lost that, have I? 50% chance of, let's say, you having to pay a penalty of $1,000, and all you stand to win is, maybe compared to that, $20. That's not a good lottery to get in. So I would suggest that if you think of the costs and benefits here, even if you think the scientists are exaggerating the risk by such a degree, it's still not a lottery that we should get into. Okay, let me just say a little bit about why this is a global ethical issue and some of the ethical questions that can be raised, and then I'll start to draw to a close. So firstly, the atmosphere is a common resource. Nobody owns it, right? It's not as if we have a particular body of air above the United States that is just our atmosphere, and other countries have the same above them. We don't. It all circulates. So if we put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, then everybody is affected by that. And the same is true if the Chinese or the Indians or the Europeans do that too. So we're sharing a common resource. Secondly, this is a scarce resource or a limited resource. When we think about the atmosphere, there's no limits to it. We can't breathe up all the oxygen in it. Well, no, we can't. But we can put so many greenhouse gases in it, so much carbon dioxide and methane, that it can't absorb it without drastic changes to the climate. In fact, arguably, we have already done that, and we're already at that point where we've used up that scarce resource of the atmosphere being able to absorb our greenhouse gases without causing really bad consequences. So we have a common resource that's scarce, and so we need principles of justice to decide how we're going to allocate it between nations. Now let's look at this principle of historical responsibility that I mentioned before. Because this is basically the principle that says, if you caused the problem, it's your responsibility to fix it. So here's a map of the world where the sizes of the countries have been exaggerated or diminished to show their cumulative contributions to the problem of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere only since the period 1950 to 2000. So not even the whole of the period since industrialization, which would give you a different picture. But even here, you can see how the United States has swollen. Europe has swollen greatly as well. And a lot of other countries have shrunk right down. In particular, sub-Saharan Africa, except for this kind of teardrop at the bottom of it, which is South Africa, has really shrunk right down. South America has shrunk very considerably. So this shows you the countries that are responsible for the problem. And then we look at the countries that are going to be most harmed by the problem. It turns out to be more or less the reverse. So the United States has now shrunk down to this skinny country there, whereas Africa has swollen enormously, because Africa is already a hot country, already a country where many people are dependent on rainfall to grow their food. So Africa swells up enormously. India gets pretty large as well. But generally, of course, the more affluent countries are the ones that are better able to cope with this and that are going to be better able to survive some of these problems. So if you like, there's a huge injustice in this if we think that historical responsibility might be an ethical principle for dealing with the problem. On that basis, the United States and the industrialized countries of Europe and Canada and Australia to some extent are the ones that really ought to be doing most of the work of overcoming this problem. Here's another way of looking at it. Even without looking at historical responsibility, what if we just look at what's happening now in terms of dividing up the greenhouse gas emissions by the population of the world, and then say which countries are emitting more than their per capita share and which countries are emitting less than their per capita share. So the United States has 5% of the world's population, or a bit less than that really, but emits 16% of the world's greenhouse gases. So it's using close to 4 times its per capita fair share. China is emitting somewhat more than its fair share, 28%, as against having 19% of the population of the world. India, on the other hand, is not even emitting half of its per capita share. So on this basis, India ought not to have obligations to do anything, at least not yet, whereas the United States ought to have very major obligations. Europe, which would come somewhere between the US and China on this, has significant obligations. China does need to do something about its emissions, but India doesn't as yet, and even poorer developing countries, like the developing countries of Africa, would be even lower. They also would not be under an obligation to do anything. So it's not unreasonable to think that we ought to be doing a leading role in this, along with other industrialized countries. What do we need to do then? Well, here's one study that was published in Nature a bit over a year and a half ago, which is of course one of the leading peer-reviewed scientific journals. And Christoph McGlade and Paul Ekins suggest that we really need to leave a lot of our fossil fuels in the ground. 1/3 of our oil reserves, half of our gas reserves, and over 80% of current coal reserves should remain unused at least until 2050. If we do that, if we were to do that, then by 2050, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere gradually do deteriorate and get absorbed, so then you get a bit more room in the atmosphere for a little bit more fossil fuel burning if that's what you still need to do. But in order to avoid these tipping points, they're saying we would have to leave over 80% of our current coal reserves unburnt, at least until 2050. So we really need to rethink energy policies and talk of putting coal miners back to work don't really make sense against the background of climate change. Okay, it's my last slide. I'm going to wind up and looking forward to some questions from you. You might say, can this be done? I've been reasonably optimistic on our ability to reduce global poverty and the progress that we've been made. And I do generally have a somewhat optimistic temperament, I suppose, on a lot of problems. Climate change, however, is really difficult to see us solving this problem. But still, I think we have to try. And this is a quote from a book by Tim Flannery called Atmosphere of Hope. He says, at younger people, addressing you younger members of the audience, need to be given the chance to create a better world for yourselves. We do have the tools to avoid climate disaster. They already exist. I've mentioned some of them, not burning fossil fuels. I could also mention drastically reducing our meat consumption because the livestock industry is a major contributor to climate change. Some of these tools may require more research and development, but we have them. We could do it if we really were to put our minds to this and put effort into it. And whether we win the race for the future is your choice. So it's your choice in terms of what you do to contribute to this problem and to hold our political leaders to account if they don't grapple with the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. But as you recently said, as you just now said, the contribution and all this stuff, I think that I come from Nepal, and I know that there's a lot of climate change awareness programs going on, and we're one of the most vulnerable countries from climate change, and our share is very less. But the thing is, a lot of these awareness programs, they are funded and managed by the countries like American NGOs and INGOs. But borrowing your concept of effective altruism, I think instead of doing awareness programs in vulnerable countries that are already knowing climate change through the changing climates and harsh weather and all that stuff, I think the effective altruism will be truly implemented if awareness programs are organized in the United States itself, where a lot of population simply refuses to believe that climate change is real. So what do you have to say about it?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's good for there to be awareness everywhere, certainly. And in some countries, Nepal may be an example, it's good if some preparations are made for predictable changes, which you will have to adapt to, because if we don't stop climate change, and it seems like we're not going to stop it absolutely, then countries that are most affected by it need to start thinking about how to prepare for it. But I totally agree with you. The real problem is in the United States and to a slightly lesser extent in Europe, also in Canada, Australia, other countries where they're emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, both in absolute terms and on a per capita basis. And there's a lot of slack, right? It would not be that difficult for them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There's lots of things that we could be doing that would be quite inexpensive, that would make a significant difference, and there's more that we can do that would make an even bigger difference. So yes, I think that's what we should be doing. We should be promoting awareness, educating people in this country. Obviously, that's what I was trying to do in the last part of my talk as far as this audience is concerned. But I think we need to go out and spread that message, and all of us need to do that, and we need to make sure that our congressional representatives actually are aware that we've understood the message and that we believe that it's correct, and that in any case, even as I said, even if there's some chance that it may not be right, it's just not worth taking that risk.
As you pointed out, that reducing climate change requires that we make significant changes to our lifestyles, like eating meat and whatnot. But as you also like noticed in the video from China, people don't like being inconvenienced or making sacrifices. So do you believe it's possible for us to put aside our self-interest in the name of like improving the world, I guess, if that makes any sense?
I do think that it's possible for us to overcome our self-interest to a significant extent. And if I didn't think that, then what I was saying about global poverty and donating or supporting effective charities wouldn't really have made sense either, because if everybody was completely selfish, then nobody would be supporting this movement. But I think there's a difference between the global poverty issue and the climate change issue, in that on climate change, I would not think that we can really just rely on individual actions. I do think it's good for individuals to take action to reduce the impact that we're all having. So, yeah, as I said, changing your diet, riding a bicycle or walking rather than driving a car where you can, changing the thermostat on your air conditioning and your heating so that you're losing less fuel, using less fuel. I mean, those are all useful things to do. But I think that you're probably right that because it's this sort of global collective action problem, if people see that most other people around them are not doing this, it takes a lot of moral fiber, really, moral determination to continue to do it yourself when you see others are not doing it. So that's why I think government needs to intervene to provide incentives for people to take action. So that could be through a carbon tax, which provides a financial incentive on people not to burn fossil fuels, perhaps more politically difficult, but I think still useful, would be a meat tax, particularly on those forms of meat that are responsible for the largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Or a cap and trade scheme where companies are given permits for how much they can emit, and then those are tradable permits, so the market tends to put a price on the cost of using carbon. I think governments should be doing that, and a number of governments are doing that. European governments have been trialling various kinds of cap and trade schemes. China is trialling cap and trade schemes in various regions. They don't have a national cap and trade scheme as yet, but they've been trialing them on a regional basis. So I think that this can be done, and I think it should be done. Whether it's going to be done in the United States with the present political makeup of both Congress and the executive seems doubtful, but who knows? You know, maybe people will see that various extreme weather events that we're having are likely to be linked with climate change, and maybe the pressure will mount so that the government does take some action.
Thank you so much for coming. And my question is about the idea of effective altruism. The way that you had been presenting it had been predominantly sort of in a distribution of capital, so people being able to donate money. And I think something that is maybe a little bit unique to the millennial generation is that they have kind of a desire to be doing things sort of that are movement or concrete actions. I think they have an interesting capacity to organize socially, and so I was wondering what your idea of what effective altruism might look like beyond charitable contributions in terms of concrete actionable steps, and if you thought that it went beyond organizing to inform representative politicians, if it could be sort of your vision of it on a local level or on an individual level beyond money.
Yeah, look, I did talk about money principally, and sometimes I give a full lecture on effective altruism, and then I spend a bit more time on other things as well. But for most people, money actually is the most effective thing that you can do, unless you're really prepared to redirect your whole life. So sure, if you are prepared to train as a doctor and go to developing countries and do cataract surgery on people who can't afford it, you may have a big impact there. But for most people who have got other commitments that tie them to their own community, then money is the obvious thing to do. Because some of the shorter things, people maybe, I don't know if you have these service trips here, but I know Princeton students have this where they may go to Latin America over the summer vacation and they spend a month or something there building houses or schools. It's generally not a very effective thing to do. It may be a good learning experience for the students to actually live in a village where people are poor. But manual labor is typically not what's in short supply in developing countries. And so they're not really providing something that isn't there. And it's, when you take into account the costs of travel and so on, it's not really a very effective thing to do. You could go and work for a non-government organization of some sort. That's definitely a possibility. There's some discussion in the effective altruism movement as to how that compares with trying to get a high-paying job and then donating more to those charities. And it will depend on your particular skills and how much you could earn and how much you could donate. But sometimes if you have the right skills, you could probably do better actually by earning a lot and donating a lot, because your skills in working for the NGO might not be very much greater than the next person who was in line for that job. So yes, you're maybe doing a slightly better job than the person who would have got it if you hadn't applied, but not by much. Whereas if you're successful in getting a high-paying job, you can donate half your salary to these organizations, and that could create a completely new position, fully funded by your donation. So that's why some effective altruists think that earning to give, as they call it, is going to be more effective than actually directly working for an NGO.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the problem is a lot more complex because the United States spends a much greater proportion of its gross national income on fighting wars that they don't provide transparency for, and also get involved in quagmires like Iraq or Vietnam, and as a result, we as taxpayers are actually funding indirectly things like bringing democracy to Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, this country has neglected to help people improve their communities or improve their infrastructure. So the one chart that you showed didn't really, it shows what we give, but indirect assistance to other countries, and it's also not really defined. But how much are we actually investing in our military to fight unnecessary wars?
Well, we're certainly investing vastly more in our military than we're investing in foreign aid programs. As I said, the foreign aid programs are less than 1% of government spending. I'm not sure what the military is now, but anybody know the figure? 30% or something? I'm not really sure. 40? 40? Okay, so yeah, that shows how much more we're investing. Now, you mentioned unnecessary wars. I certainly think it's pretty clear that when George W. Bush went to war in Iraq, that was firstly based on a mistake, claims about weapons of mass destruction which didn't exist. Also, some idea of bringing democracy to Iraq, whereas in fact, clearly Iraq has been very badly damaged, and it's helped to spread terrorism throughout that region, which we're now contending with. So I think that's not only an unnecessary war, but a totally disastrous war at vast costs. So yes, I completely agree with you there. We could have used those resources to do much more good in the world instead of actually doing harm in the world. Now, that's not to say that all of the spending that we have on our military is wasted. I'm not a pacifist. I do think that in the world as it is now, we need some defense forces. So exactly how much we ought to be spending or not to be spending is a more complicated question. But yeah, I think that we have not spent our resources really wisely in terms of getting the best value out of them. Totally agree with you on that.
Yes, I'm just curious. So you say that you're hopeful about us being able to tackle global poverty, but not too sure about us being able to tackle climate change. But do you think that we could actually tackle global poverty without tackling climate change? I mean, don't the two kind of go hand in hand? And also, what do you think about America's current political system or political atmosphere? Because America kind of is the world leader, so if we stop doing things on climate change, I'm pretty sure most nations, at least most industrial nations, are going to take their cues from us and not bother with it that much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, a number of points there. So firstly, yes, you're right that when I said we can tackle global poverty, I'm bracketing off the ramifications of climate change for global poverty. I think without disastrous climate change, we could, within maybe 20 or 30 years, eradicate large-scale global poverty. There'll be pockets of poverty remaining. But if climate change continues unabated, then that's going to impose huge new burdens, which, as I showed in that map, will particularly fall on developing countries. And so we'll actually lose a lot of the gains that we've made in terms of global poverty. So I think you're completely correct. And to some extent, I should have been more explicit of what I was saying. Those two things do go together. Now, the other thing you said was, if the United States in its current political atmosphere does not do something about climate change, what will be the impact of this? Well, certainly the impact will be very negative. You suggested that other industrialized nations will then also not do anything. Maybe, I don't know. The Europeans seem to me to be pretty clearly committed to their proposals, to keeping their pledges they made at Paris, for example. I'd be really surprised if the European Union nations backed away from that, more or less whatever the United States does. On the other hand, I think, for example, India would be quite likely to back away, because India could well say, we've still got hundreds of millions of people in extreme poverty. You don't. Yet you're not fulfilling your pledges. Why should we fulfill ours? That seems, pretty much an irrefutable argument, really. And then in between Europe and India might be China. China, I'm not sure. I kind of have the sense that China is now fairly well committed to doing a good deal about climate change, partly because I think they realize that it's necessary for their own good. They've had disastrous floods in the past and rainfall variation, so they also are well aware, I think. I don't think there's any doubters really about the reality of climate change in the higher echelons of the Chinese government. So maybe they would reduce to some extent what they're doing, but I don't think they would back away from it entirely. But the United States is such a major contributor, second only to China in absolute terms, that without the United States, it'll be very hard to make progress.
So I actually have a question that's related to your scenario. When you have the man pass the little girl who's been hit, and he just walks by, I almost feel like if there was an app for it and you could just press on your phone, it was convenient to call the police and move the girl's body over, they would act. And there is technology that kind of helps different things, the World Community Grid. You can have computers run in the background things that research and increase rice production or weather patterns in sub-Saharan Africa or the Zika virus. And it takes nothing but to let your computer run it in your background. And I inform my students every semester about this to tell them to do it. And every semester, out of about 100 students, 25 per class, 1 to 2 a semester do it. So if you can't even get people to load something on their computer easily and run it in the background, what chances are there to motivate people to actually put capital, energy, time, and investment into these causes?
I can't really comment exactly on what the problem is that's blocking your students loading these apps. I guess I don't know enough about the situation. One thing that is generally true is that en masse we tend, we tend to be somewhat conformist, and so if you would get to the stage where 20 or 30% of your class are loading these apps, it would probably be easier to build on that and go further. But if you're at a situation where only 1 or 2 out of 100 are doing it, then they're the rare nonconformists, and probably, I don't know, other people think, well, my friends are not doing this, why should I do it? So sometimes it's a matter of getting up to this critical mass level to get more people to do it.
Well, sorry. Firstly, I wanted to thank you, Professor Singer, for just coming to Kutztown in general. It's actually great to see this. With this being said, I wanted to talk kind of briefly, without going in, because I don't want to actually take up anyone else's time, but debating with, sorry, don't know how to word this correctly, so bear with me, but going with the political parties, whether you're Republican, Democratic, or Independent, what I'm actually extremely curious in is how you think we as the millennials, considering we harbor so much change and almost like a revolution in the sense of how much power we have, how we could bring about this concern or warning to this global disaster. Regarding the presidential's, president candidate that states he doesn't necessarily believe in global warming. Would it be like, I don't know, like writing like peaceful protests or anything along those lines?
Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing that should have happened, I guess, and apparently didn't, is that all of the millennials ought to have got out and voted. That's really, tragic, I think, that a lot of people whose future is going to be very much affected by what happened last Tuesday, Tuesday before last, actually didn't participate in that decision. So given that has happened, what can you do next? I was actually not particularly supportive of the protests that occurred immediately after the election. I mean, I could understand that people wanted to somehow express their feelings and maybe get together with other people who felt the same, kind of a group therapy, you might say. But, this is a democracy. Personally, I greatly regret the outcome of the election, but I don't think you can protest against the result of a democratic election. I mean, you could protest about why do we have an electoral college rather than popular vote, that kind of thing. But I think the time is when decisions are made or when decisions are starting to build. You usually get media reports about decisions under consideration. That's the time to get out there and show that, for instance, if there is any discussion about backing away from fulfilling the pledge that the United States made at the Paris climate discussions, then that's the time when everyone ought to get out and make their feelings felt through peaceful protest. I'm definitely peaceful, but I do think that there is a place for peaceful protest. There's an honourable tradition. Even peaceful civil disobedience is going back to Martin Luther King, where we honour as a political leader who brought justice to the south of the United States in particular. And I think this is an issue on the same scale or on an even larger scale because it's a global issue, not just a US one. So I would see a time for that when it seems clear, if it seems clear, that decisions are going to go in the wrong way on these questions.
Thanks. You put forth a very compelling argument regarding why countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom ought to provide for countries that are in need of provisions, especially, in my opinion, with regards to the net for malaria. But I'm wondering if that also implies, given the scenario that these countries don't actually provide assistance, whether countries in need have a moral right to seize the means of production for those needs.
That's an interesting question. So I don't know that it's actually a practical question. I'm not sure whether these countries could do that, or if they were to do it, what repercussions would be opened up. But if you're raising that as a philosophical question, there is a good argument for saying that's so, and somewhat surprisingly, that argument is deeply embedded in Roman Catholic moral thinking. So there's a tradition in Roman Catholic thinking which is quite clearly expressed by some of the greatest thinkers in that tradition, including Thomas Aquinas, that says that what you have in abundance, in other words, what you have beyond what you need to meet your needs, you owe to the poor for their sustenance. And Aquinas actually goes on to say that if, let's say, you've got more than you need, imagine you're a wealthy person laying out a great feast, and in the neighborhood there's a man whose family are starving, and he comes into the room and takes a loaf of bread from your table, which has got more than you need and you and your friends need to eat, and he takes that bread. He has not stolen it. It's not theft because you do not have a right to it against him. The rights to property in the natural law tradition depend on the value of property in meeting our needs. So if this property is not meeting your need, but could meet someone else's need, then you lose your right to it and he gains a right to it. So it's not actually theft. So you could perhaps apply this in this situation if there are countries that have more than they need, and we are certainly one of those countries, and other countries do not have enough what they need, and therefore take something of ours to feed their people or to protect them against malaria. That would seem to be justified within this tradition. It's not actually quite my tradition, but I can see the point there. There's one caveat that ought to be said, and that is in a number of these countries where people are in poverty, there is still a small elite that is quite wealthy. And often that's the ruling elite. So I don't think they're in a position to take from the United States or the United Kingdom, while they're actually living in their own little bubble of abundance in the developing country. It would only be if they had already done what they could to help meet the needs of their people in their country, and they had no more left really to help, that then that would arise.
Okay. So you showed us how the number of people living in extreme poverty across the world has been declining since the 1980s. And you mentioned that it might have something to do with major economic changes internationally. We've heard a lot about international trade deals this election season in America, and I'm curious what effect you think free trade deals have on global poverty or poverty in the developing countries that we might be trading with.
Yeah, I'm not really expert enough to speak specifically about the deals, let's say about the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, which was discussed in the election. But certainly, I do think that trade deals like the WTO and particularly China's entry into the WTO did contribute to helping China and other poor countries to improve their position. Not only China, Bangladesh, for example, has developed a major clothing manufacturing trade with wealthier nations. Often, as we saw in the Rana Plaza disaster, the conditions were very bad for the workers, but still, on the whole, that helped to give people some income that they would not otherwise have had. So I think that on the whole, those were beneficial. And actually, one of the curious items in the election, if you go back to the earlier primary days of the election, was that there seemed to be one thing that both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders agreed on, and that is in their opposition to these international trade deals. And they both seemed to be opposing it. It was clearer in the case of Trump than Sanders, but I think when you look at what they said on their websites and in their speeches, they were both opposing it on the grounds that it's bad for American workers. And perhaps that's true. I mean, that's something for economists to debate. Some economists will say, well, we lost some jobs in the manufacturing sector, but we gained other jobs in services sectors, for example. But even if it is true, you would think at least that someone like Bernie Sanders would sort of think, well, maybe this is bad for American workers, but maybe it's good for Chinese workers. And maybe since Chinese workers are much poorer than American workers, on the whole, it produces a more just world, a more equitable world, rather than a worse one.
Thank you. I do appreciate about everything you say. I think it's what people were saying is there's a big difference between interest and commitment. So we come here, we're interested in doing something about global warming, and then we go off and ride in private cars to our houses where we live many miles from here, and we commute. So it just strikes me as somewhat ironic. Just a comment. And the other question I had about your first point about people living in extreme poverty, just to make sure I understand, according to what you say, given that there are millions of people living in extreme poverty, this suggests that it would be immoral for anyone right now to contribute money to a charity, say that was a museum or art museum, or for that matter to a university foundation, when there still are people whose basic needs are not being met. Is that correct?
That's certainly correct about the art museum, for example. At least if it's, I think that there's cultural heritage that ought to be protected. So I don't want, for example, the National Gallery in Washington or whatever to have no funds so that the roof falls in and all the works in it get ruined. But if they were thinking of renovating it in order to provide a nicer viewing space, similar to what's happening to the Philharmonic Hall, I would say no, you shouldn't give to that. And you shouldn't give to like new opera houses or something of that sort. Educational institutions are a little trickier because they could be seen as an investment in the future. That is, they could be seen as educating future generations so that firstly, people have the skills and ability to bring about a better world, and secondly, they have the opportunity to think about how they're going to live their lives, what they're going to do with their lives. And hopefully, significant number of them will think about contributing to make the world a better place. So if we were to abandon funding of educational institutions, we would in that sense be abandoning that hope for the future, and I certainly don't want to do that. That's not to say that everything that educational institutions do is justified in that way, but the idea of having excellent education in itself, I think, is something that's worth funding. Exactly how you compare it with the more immediate things that I talked about is obviously a difficult choice. Thanks very much. Thank you.